Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Terminal Philosophy. This is episode 25 of our History of Warfare series, where we're discussing in the first of three parts the Roman Unification of Italy. And to start off, I want to discuss the mechanisms by which Rome united Italy. One of Rome's greatest assets and greatest innovation was its relationship with non-Roman citizens. There was a lot of ways that you could be a friend of Rome. You could be an ally, a full citizen, a half citizen, and it created these multiple ways you could relate to Rome without being an enemy. And in antiquity, if you went to war with somebody, there's only one of two outcomes. If you lost, you were wiped out or you were enslaved. The Romans sort of invented a third option. You can become a part of this political ecosystem, ranging again from an ally to a full citizen. And the other thing the Romans did was they would incorporate the gods of the cities they took. And this is, in one sense, to build goodwill with that city. So it's like, oh yeah, we think your god is pretty swell too. And also, it was sort of Rome hedging its bets, so to speak, by getting as many gods on their side as possible. So, if they were fighting another enemy, they could say, well, look how many gods we have on our side. How many do you have on yours? Rome also had lots of bilateral treaties. So a city would have a treaty with Rome, but then couldn't have a treaty with another city, tying Rome's allies closer to it. They had a sophisticated propaganda apparatus whereby the priests would construe all of Rome's wars as just wars. Tertullian once quipped that, Rome conquered the world, just with just wars, which, of course, in his mind was ludicrous. But this sort of morally fortified righteousness that the Romans had of their own cause was a tremendous boon to their fighting capability. Their superior logistics. So, for example, the Via Appia was created in order to help both supply Roman troops fighting the Samnites and support march Roman troops down to fight the Samnites. The use of colonies, they would, at strategic locations like passes or river estuaries or, inlets, they would build essentially little colonies of Roman citizens or maybe allies to help cement Rome's control over a region, giving them much more direct control than otherwise. And because of this political ecosystem that could incorporate more and more peoples into it, Rome had, there was a snowball effect where Rome had nearly unlimited manpower reserves, or for all practical purposes, more than any of which Rome's enemies could match. And it's this staying power of having a larger population due to this political arrangement that gives Rome the edge. Because while Rome might not win every battle, as we saw with Pyrrhus, they can still keep on sending armies out. There's always another army. There's always another army. And it's like, eventually, even the great Pyrrhus got ground down by that strategy. So those are basically a summary of the methods that Rome used to unite Italy. Terminal Philosophy, any thoughts on Rome's methods?
Right, yeah, there's a lot to cover here. Well, I would say that Rome, just from studying this, early history of Rome, which I think is something that's well outside of the general public consciousness, Rome conquered the Italian peninsula by four basic methods, which you covered, and it's basically by war, diplomacy, I would say colonizing, and then the sort of passive absorption, giving various populations the option of joining their political and cultural ethos. Yes, it's definitely true to say that in the earlier wars that Rome had with the Etruscans or the Volscians, the Latins or the Gauls, and others, that Rome adopted many local gods of these conquered peoples. And I think, one of the main political mechanisms that made it possible for the Romans to conquer this initial territory, or just this greater Italian peninsula, is that I would say the Roman Senate was more of a dynamic political mechanism than sort of a despot or a ruling king who, once you cut the head off of the snake, typically city states are left, in some sort of political disarray, or they cannot. It's hard for them to come back from that. Whereas a Senate allows for you to, delegate power more broadly amongst the people. I would say, for example, in the war with Clusium, in the war against Lars Porsena, initially sent an army to attack Rome from the west across the Tiber, and the Roman Senate heard of his. They learned of Porsena's army coming there, and at the time there was some difficulty between the Senate and the Roman population. But what they ended up doing was they ended up canceling the taxes for lower class people and for the farmers in the surrounding countryside. They exempted a lot of workers from dock work and from taxes from sort of the middle class of Rome. And so what they were trying to do is essentially win over the people in sort of a political PR campaign to rally them against Porsena's army. Whereas I think, in other examples throughout history, say a power like Persia, you would just get this, brutal, boot on the throat approach to where, you're forced to do it, or, things will get bloody, or you'll be taken away from your family, you'll be put into slavery, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, those general four methods, and I think that they did a decent job of doing a lot of trade in their area, similar to the Phoenicians. They had a good sense of naval trade with, before things got bad between them and Carthage. There was trade routes all throughout the Mediterranean that led to and from Rome, and this went all the way to actually the Phoenician homeland, and this went, places like Cyprus and Western Turkey, and all the way to places like Gibraltar and the northern African coast. So yeah, there wasn't just one approach, like just war or just diplomacy. They were very dynamic. So I would just say war, diplomacy, colonizing, and sort of this openness to absorbing local populations, and therefore kind of keeping the religion more encompassing and less exclusionary.
Yeah. Now, with the birth of the Republic in 509 BC, with the expulsion of the Etruscan king Tarquin Superbus, with the first series of wars are Rome fighting against the attempt to reassert the royal power of the Tarquin. The first war culminates at the Battle of Silva Arvisa, where Tarquin Superbus leads a coalition of Veii and Tarquinii to reclaim Rome, appealing to his kinship ties to the Tarquinii and the fear of Roman power to Veii. And at the battle, the Roman horse is commanded by Lucius Junius Brutus, and the Roman foot by Publius Valerius. Tarquin commands the Etruscan foot, and his son Aruns the Etruscan horse. And Aruns charges Brutus, trying to challenge him to a single combat where both men kill each other. And in this battle, according to Livy, both left flanks of the armies were routed and both right flanks were victorious. But it would seem that with the loss of Aruns, presumably the crown prince, the Etruscans lost heart and left the field. And Tarquin stirs up trouble again by a year later in 508 by going to Lars Porsena at Clusium. And the first thing that happens in this engagement is the famous story of Horatio at the bridge. So as Lars Porsena's army is trying to cross the Sublician Bridge over the Tiber, most of the troops flee except three. One, Horatius, defends the bridge, and the other two men attempt to dismantle the bridge. And while he through his daring holds off the army and long enough for the bridge to be dismantled, he then swims back to the other side of the river. But Lars Porsena then marches towards Rome and fortifies the Januculum, and he then ends up besieging Rome itself. The Romans, in preparation for this, pull supplies from the countryside and decide, and sort of store it up in Rome and not give Lars Porsena much to live off the land, so to speak. And there isn't really a battle that gets Lars to leave. It seems that, at least according to Livy, the Romans, through a series of individual heroics, one of them is a certain Mucius, who snuck into the camp and attempted to assassinate Lars, and instead killed the quartermaster who was giving wages to the troops. And in order to show his fearlessness in the face of the enemy, the fire that was supposed to have burned him as punishment, he sticks his hand over it, his right hand, and lets it smolder, showing to Lars he's not afraid to die, and that all Romans are like him, and this is what he can expect in the future. And also a matron of Rome, Cloelia, escapes from Lars, and she then, by swimming across a river while being attacked by javelins. And so this sort of Roman courage and determination seems to have convinced Lars that this wasn't worth a fight. It just wasn't worth it. So he backs off and goes home and makes peace with Rome. In a sort of the Latin War that follows in the 490s, culminating at the Battle of Lake Regillus, was a reversal of the rape of the Sabine women. This time the Sabines raped the Roman women and took some of them. So the Romans weren't too happy about that. And that led to a broader conflict with the Latin League. The Roman consuls Sulpicius and Manlius Tullius invested the city of Fidene and took the Latin city of Crustamaria and helped facilitate a revolt in Praeneste. And at that point, the Latin League organized itself to fight the Romans. And at the Battle of Lake Regillus, Tarquin was again there. Tarquin is always looking for a chance to get back and take over Rome. Now, the leadership here is, as I already said, Sulpicius and Manlius and Tarquin. And Tarquin leads, even though he's very old at this point, is still leading troops from the front. And he attempted to take out the Roman consul Postumius, but failed and withdrew because, being as old as he was outmatched. And then the Roman master of the horse Abadius charged at the Tuscan general Mamilius, wounding him with a lance, but then was in turn wounded by other Etruscan forces, and they both withdrew from the fight. Which then the Etruscans and the Latins pressured the Romans. And then the tide turned again when the Roman commander Valerius charged to try to kill the Tarquin. But he outran his own troops and it was then slain by the Etruscans, which then provoked Postumius, the dictator, to run and claim the body of Valerius so they wouldn't have it as a trophy. And leading those troops with his cavalry, he then breaks through the Tuscan and Latin forces. And a certain T. Herminius sees the Tuscan general Manlius, and this time he does kill him with his lance. And the Roman cavalry men attribute their victory to Castor and Pollux, the sort of patron deities of cavalry. And there's some, inconclusive fighting afterwards, but eventually the Latins sign a treaty with the Romans, creating a foedus Cassinium. And this is really huge, right? With the Latin League being tied to Rome, Rome is now no longer just a small upstart state. It's now one of the players able to go toe-to-toe with the Etruscans from Veii, going toe-to-toe with the Volscians or the Aqui, or the Hernicans. So now the Romans are established. And then furthermore, the Tarquin threat is once and for all finally done with. And so this is the Etruscan Wars. Really, you might say the Tarquin War, because in all these wars, Tarquin is sort of behind the scenes stirring things up. So the only other thing I'd add before I pass it on to you, Terminal Philosophy, is that Roman cavalry often get kind of overlooked by the legion and often get a bad rap against the complete badassery of Hannibal's Numidian cavalry. But given that the Numidian cavalry were probably the best horsemen in the Western Mediterranean, that's a pretty high bar. But in its early days, Roman cavalry, especially in these wars against the Etruscans and Volscians, appears to be extremely decisive. And it's something that many historians of Roman military strategy might not at first glance notice.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'll probably work backwards from some of the points that you made. I think it's generally true to say that Roman cavalry were much more decisive against the Etruscans and the Volscians and their conflicts with the Latin League than most people are willing to give them credit for. Yeah, sadly, I think Rome's cavalry got a bad reputation because of being basically chewed up by Hannibal. But according to Livy and Diodorus Siculus, there was a much stronger equestrian tradition in the Carthaginian territory than there was in these early days of Rome. I think, honestly, that's just due to the lack of territory that Rome, had at the point, whereas Carthaginians are generally agreed upon as being, the successors of the Phoenicians. So, there was just access to greater trade from various lands, which means you probably have access to horses. So I think they just had a longer standing with, a better practice with cavalry. So that's definitely true. I would definitely agree with you there. And then, these wars that you had just gone through, these various conflicts, could be thought of as the Tarquin War, because it's basically Tarquin, carrying out various attempts to retake the throne. And, what you have is just a well-oiled war machine that Rome was able to put up against, Tarquin and some of these attempts. Of course, there's the famous, Horatius Cocleus and Titus Hermanus Aquinlius. Sorry, I'm probably butchering that last one. And Spurius Lardius at the bridge on the Tiber, where Lars Porsena had tried to send his army across, but they ended up destroying the bridge and swimming across the river. So this almost reminds me of some of these other battles, like during the Pyrrhic War, where on Sicily, we talked about the battle. I forget the name of the battle, but there was basically I think the Sicilians pretended to be the reinforcing cavalry of what was it? It would have been Hannibal's grandfather, I think, and they ended up being from Sicily and not from Carthage, and they ended up slaughtering the camp on the beach. And so, I guess the point I'm getting at is that rather than being routed in a traditional battle, there was one particular event that prevented the army from engaging in its broader conflict. So here, we have the bridge destroyed at the Tiber, and then that forces Lars Porsena at best to sort of raid the surrounding countryside. But ultimately, his siege fails because he just does not have the numbers, and he doesn't have the supplies to maintain a longer siege. And then of course there's the Battle of Lake Regillus, which is basically Tarquin's last attempt at, and this is along with the Latin League. This is his final attempt to really take the throne back from the Roman Senate. But here, what you just touched on is basically a successful flanking maneuvers by the Roman cavalry. And this is what leads to, honestly, Rome just, taking up a lot of territory via, the treaty with the Latin League. And as you said before, this is where Rome goes from a city-state with basically a city and its walls, and then a surrounding countryside to, actual like real substantial territories. So, but again, Rome doesn't come in and just kill all of the those who are defeated. They basically absorb these various Latin peoples under their cultural umbrella, because here, most regardless regardless of the adversarial nature between Rome and the Etruscans and the Volscians, many of them could communicate with each other because they're very similar languages. And so it wasn't like Persia invading Greece. It was, it was a closer cultural ties there. So, yeah, and I think, again, Roman cavalry just doesn't quite get the reputation it deserves. Although, when you're going up against Hannibal, it's a tough standard to beat.
Yeah, exactly. This next section would probably be best summed up as the Volscian Wars, the first round of the Volscian Wars, a perennial enemy of Rome at this time. The first incident happened shortly after Lake Regillus, where the Volscians believe that Rome is weakened because of its recent war with Latium, and so they attack. But the Latins tip off the Romans to this, and in order to show good faith, and then in return, the Romans released 6,000 prisoners from the late war. The main underlying issue for both this conflict, the Volscian Wars, and then later on the Fabii War against Veii, is the civil strife between the tribunes and the plebs. Basically, what ends up happening is debtors and creditors are sort of essentially squeezing out the plebs, forcing them to sell their farms and sell their children. And of course, they're the ones that are fighting and dying for Rome. And they're just like, well, wait a minute. We're doing all of this, and this is how you treat us. Numerous points, which we'll get to later, the plebs straight up mutinied and didn't even fight the enemy. So Rome is actually probably more threatened here than it was under the Tarquin War, because with Tarquin, everybody was on the same side. Nobody wanted the Tarquin to come back. But here, it's like the Roman state was at war with itself at the same time it was at war with all of its neighbors. And so that was really not great for Romans. But Servilius, consul, was able to gain the Roman army to swell in size by saying, well, look, here's a compromise. Anybody who joins the army and can, prove that they're on military duty, because we do need an army, we're being invaded, you and yours will be exempt from any sort of financial shenanigans, which at the time was a compromise that worked. And the initial Volscians were scattered, and Servilius took the town of Susia Pomedia, and then the town of Ectra sought peace with Rome, seeing how the Volscian town Ectra made peace with Rome, seeing how the winds had changed. And then again, due to internal strife, again, the plebs versus the patricians, the Volscian Sabines and Aqui invade Rome. They think, oh, this is time. The troops, the plebs are not going to fight. The Roman consul Maximus orders his men to take defensive positions, planting their spears in the ground, which I think in the Polybian Legion, that's what the Triarii would do. So it almost sounds like that Maximus is putting the Triarii up front. But they sit there and wait for the attack. The Volscians were sort of overconfident, and when they charged the Romans, they were not fighting in good order and exhausted themselves. And so when they got close enough for the Romans to use their swords, they were cut to pieces. And the Romans took the city of Velitraea. And then there were minor conflicts after that. There was Postumus, Cominius, Arunicus, who defeated a Volscian raid, capturing Antium, Longula, and Palusca. And then the Roman consul Coriolanus captured the Volscian city Corioli, hence his cognomen. And then the Volscians attacked Rome when she was under famine, thinking that would be a good time to attack. But it turns out the disease was spreading through the Volscian ranks, and they had to call off the siege. now we get to Coriolanus, who's famous for his biography and Plutarch and in the Shakespeare play. And his whole drama is in the middle of this feud between the patricians and the plebs. Coriolanus, being a hero from the Volscian Wars, he's a patrician maximalist. He wants to have the maximum power for the patricians, and he's not interested in compromising at all with the people, even though Rome is on the verge of civil war. And so the more moderate patricians side with the plebs and banish Coriolanus. And Coriolanus commits treason against Rome by allying with the Volscians. And a certain Attius Tullus Phidias is his sort of like a double on the Volscian side. And so they plot an invasion of Rome. And the way they create this incident is they get the Romans. Phidias goes to Rome saying that, I'm not saying the Volscians are going to revolt, but they're going to revolt. It's basically, they're not aliens, but they're aliens. The UFO guy from the History Channel. And he wants the Romans to overreact to then expel the Volscian population, because these festivals to the gods of Italy, it's theoretically open to all of Rome's allies and all friendly tribes. And so they feel used. And then Coriolanus says, oh yeah, the Romans were intentionally trying to humiliate you. So this is all really dark. Like they tricked the Romans into overreacting. Coriolanus, commits treason against his country, then lies to the Volscians who were expelled in order to get a war with Rome. And he's essentially a military genius and takes city after city after city. And this is why Livy writes that because of this, Rome's early victories were the result of her leadership, not her troops, because Coriolanus could achieve victories just as easily leading Volscians as he could leading Romans. Which we'll see later on, it would seem that in later periods in Roman history, it's their troop capacity that's superior to the enemy rather than generalship, because clearly Pyrrhus was the greater general in the Pyrrhic Wars. And again, according to both Livy and Plutarch, it was intercessions from the matrons of Rome and Coriolanus's mother, Petruria, and his wife Volumnia, which sort of got him to call off the attack. The Volscians were understandably very angry and assassinated him. And then when the Volscians were trying to find new allies, the Aqui did not like having Attius Phidias as the commanding over them. So they fell into civil infighting in a miniature civil war, which led to Attius's death. And so the Volscian threat just evaporated away. There's more inconclusive fighting, mainly with the status quo ante being maintained. Again, the main issue here is that the Romans have a hard time utilizing their manpower to the fullest because of the civil war, soft civil war between the plebs and the patricians. One of the first instances of decimation by Consul Appius Claudius was used in these Volscian wars in order to get them to fight. And so this is sort of the end of what we might call the Volscian War phase. So what are some of your thoughts on the Volscian War?
Right. Well, I think the Volscians were a more capable enemy than Tarquin, although they could never quite conquer Rome due to, whether it was logistics or, in the case of the earlier days of Volscian conflicts, like famine, and also Coriolanus and other Volscian attempts at Rome, they could never fully take advantage of things that were going on inside Rome. As you said earlier, the plebs were being exploited by the patricians through taxes and unrealistically long service in the army, being pressured to hand over valuable property and so forth. And Servilius was responsible for making life more fair for the plebs if they continued to serve in the army. So that's what initially held off the Volscians was, like Rome was sort of like internally on the verge of some sort of civil war, and so Servilius was able to level the playing field a bit for the plebs. And Servilius was also, even due to this, Servilius lost some favorability with various patricians in Rome at the time, which you would kind of find hard to believe, but yeah, there it is. Now, interestingly enough, when you were talking about Coriolanus, I did read that during his siege with Rome, trying to take advantage, like doing this like war by deception, both with his own Volscian men and baiting the Romans. Coriolanus's mother and his wife and his sons basically went out to his camp and basically begged him to just end the attack. And he is more or less persuaded by their pleas. And so he moved his encampment further away from the city and basically ended the siege there. And Rome ended up later honoring those women, and they made a temple. I think it was dedicated to Fortuna. So that's kind of another sort of interesting anecdotal event that had an outcome on a battle. So rather than just traditional flanking maneuvers and the quality of phalanx or legion formations fighting each other. So I thought that was quite interesting, as one of the more interesting events in the Volscian campaigns. But I would say in general, the Volscians were probably a more capable enemy than Tarquin. I also did learn that at the Battle of what was it, Lake? Oh my gosh, I have it right here. Oh, Lake Regillus. That a Volscian force was on the way, but they could never reach the battlefield in time, so they were just late, and they just couldn't make it, either due to terrain or just other factors. But I think you covered the Volscian conflict pretty well.
Now, the next conflict here is, broadly speaking, the Etruscan conflict, but more narrowly, it's the war with the war with Veii, which becomes one of Rome's most persistent enemies and one of its most determined enemies in its early days. And so, after the Volscian threat has been dealt with, the Etruscans from Veii decide to exploit Rome's misfortune by invading. And a Q Fabius and C Julius defeated an invading Vitian and Acqui army. And this is where I mentioned earlier, their cavalry alone. And it was because the plebs had mutinied and weren't going to fight the Etruscans. And I think it was in the earlier, where in the war with the Volscians, when the hostility to the patricians was so great that the plebs said, well, better be conquered by the Volscians than to serve the patricians. Like that's how bad things had gotten. And they straight up mutiny. They didn't even fight. And these attacks continue, and the Roman house Fabii gains notoriety by sort of shouldering much of the burden of defending Rome's northern frontier in this regard. The mutinous, now this particular the major engagement here has Quintus Fabius Manlius and his troops are in camp, and so basically he's like, well, we can't really use them to fight the Etruscans, so we're just going to keep them in camp. And then the Etruscans start taunting the Romans, saying that they're using the excuse of dissension to cover up for their cowardice. And so eventually the sort of patriotism of the plebs overcomes their resentment of the patricians. And the consuls are like, well, hold on, we want to pretend that we don't want to fight in order to make it appear as if it was the plebs' decision to fight, in order that they'll be more likely to continue fighting these people as well. And once they finally see that the time is ripe, the consuls have the plebs swear to Jupiter and Mars that they would fight that day. And we see that Quintus Fabius was slain by an Etruscan champion, and his brothers led a rescue effort to recover the body for proper burial. The Etruscans, having superior numbers, grew careless and looted the Roman camp, while the Triarii, who had been guarding the camp, sent messengers to the consul Manlius who then led a relief force to reclaim the Roman camp and defeat the Etruscan assault. But he was killed in the attack, which again swung the pendulum in the Etruscan favor again. But then more Romans came and recovered Manlius's body and drove the Etruscans away. And then after this battle, House Fabii goes to Rome and starts making a lot of braggadocious noise that they're going to single-handedly fight Veii and that they don't need, tax money from Rome. And for a time, it seems like they're able to do it. They have like an elite force of like 306, 307 men. The Vaetians don't really attack the Romans, the Fabians, head on. They pursue a kind of like hit and run guerrilla warfare strategy, and trying to build forts at strategic locations to hem in the Romans. But the Romans are able to either capture the fortified locations, defeat them in pitched battles. And so the Fabii sort of become overconfident, and they think the Etruscans are a pushover. So finally, the Vaetians lure the Romans into a valley with cattle. So like, and there's an army that's pretending to run away, and they're like, the cowardly Etruscans, we're just going to loot their livestock. And then as the Romans march in, up on the hills and the cliffs, the Etruscan army shows up and just pours javelin fire down on the Romans, and they're killed. All of them are killed. And I think only like one boy who was like a serving boy escapes and tells Rome of the disaster. And so they basically get wrecked. And then the Vetians position themselves on the Janiculum, much like Lars Porsena did. But due to overconfidence, they fall for the same ambuscade that they trapped the Fabii in, and their army is destroyed there. And then a second battle occurs where they're trying to avenge their first defeat. And the Roman army that they're initially facing is having a rough time. Looks like they may actually win. But then Roman forces who had been fighting the Hernicans were called back to defend Rome and attacked the Etruscan force in the rear. And so in this sort of sandwiched hammer and anvil strategy, they were wiped out. And at that point, Veii is not really a problem anymore, at least for the time being. There's another engagement at 474 where the Romans, it wasn't quite clear from the sources, but it sounded like they were besieging Veii, and the Sabines came to Veii's rescue. And so a consul, Publius Valerius Publicola, I think he also has a biography in Plutarch, with his Latin and Hernican allies, attacked the Sabine camp. And seeing this as an opportunity, the Vaetians attacked as well, but they were in turn defeated. And with their allies defeated and their army defeated, but the city's still too strong to take, because the Romans wouldn't take Veii until like around the 390s. So that's pretty much done. And what ends up happening is we get to see, after all of these wars, the Tarquin War, the Volscian Wars, the Veii War, is that it appears in the historical record there's a lull of like 50, 60 years in the fighting. And it's probably due to the fact that, Rome and its neighbors had been at war continually for like 3 generations. I think everybody was just tapped out. And so Rome also had to incorporate its gains, right? Rome could not just keep on growing and growing and growing, because you had to incorporate these gains and, settle colonists and incorporate the Latins. And that takes time. And furthermore, Rome also had to deal with the pleb and the pleb patrician issue. And that was finally resolved with the creation of the tribune of the plebs, a figure who was sacred, who could not be killed without, incurring the wrath of the gods from the point of view of the Romans, but had veto power and was the advocate for the plebeians. Now he was, I think, chosen from the patricians, but he represented the plebeian interests, and so that's how that was done. So any further expansion would have to wait until they've sorted that out. But I think basically what explains the next, say, 60 years of uneventful history is the fact that everybody was just tapped out from like almost 3 generations of continuous war. Rome is fighting from like 509 to 474 against, the Etruscans and the Latins and the Volscians and the Aqui and the Sabines. It's brutal. And at the same time, they're trying to keep the plebs and the patricians from killing each other. So what are some of your thoughts, terminal philosophy, on the Vetian War?
Right. Well, that's a great summary. I think between the Fabian War and the sort of the Vatian and Sabine alliances that came in like 475. I think that's an overall good summary in the sense that after these various wars with its neighbors, Rome had more or less exhausted both its military striking capabilities, plus dealing with the social problems at home between the plebs and the patricians. One thing I'll say is that there's sort of a spectrum here of capable enemies, which started with Tarquin, then proceeded to get a bit more difficult with the Volscians, and then sort of culminated it with the Vatians. So, and I wasn't sure if it was Vatian or Vientes, or Vientes. So we'll just kind of go with Vetians for now. But despite all of their successful attempts by like war by deception and luring in Romans to get out of their usual and highly defendable legion formations, one thing that Rome always had on its side was its ability to raise armies quickly, and this was basically by patricians just leveraging on the plebs to sort of the soft manipulation on patriotism, and you have a duty to defend Rome and so on and so forth. So that is one of Rome's more impressive capabilities, and we saw this in the episode with the Pyrrhic War, where Pyrrhus, as you said earlier, and I definitely agree that he was probably the most capable commander, although he was probably a bit too daring. He was even in defeating Rome in several occasions, Rome was always able to replace their losses very quickly, whereas Pyrrhus, like the Germans in World War II, just couldn't replace these huge losses that were eventually incurred. So I think that's what the city-state of Veii could not really compete with, was this ability to just raise an army as quickly as Rome could. However, I think by the time that the Fabian conflict had concluded, again, this is coming from Livy as well, that that he basically described an exhaustion across basically the countryside between all these various city-states. And Rome, although Rome, was still standing in the most victorious, you could say, on paper, it had a lot of domestic issues, and it had a lot of colonizing to carry out, and it had, there's basically a loss of a lot of population. It wasn't like, we're not talking like Black Plague levels loss of population, but certainly many of the younger men of these cities were dead from war, and so they had to replenish these populations through basically that period of about 60 years, 70 years, where there's just like virtually no combat, or at least none that the historical record can recall. So yeah, very interesting. But and then here once again too, with even against the Vetians, is the successful use of Roman cavalry again on the far flanks and sort of hammer and anvil style. But and I think the Vetians had their own cavalry. However, it wasn't as numerous and not as organized or well equipped as Rome. But I think what the Vetians had on their side was basically its geographic location, it was relatively close to Rome, so they could wage war against Rome's agricultural countryside without having to march these huge distances that, something, that Alexander had to deal with, centuries earlier. So I think I'll leave
Yeah,
it at that.
yeah. It is really interesting. Rome, the military history of Rome, we tend to think of the legions and Romans infantry as its key asset, but it seems in these very early wars that the Roman infantry were not anything to write home about. They weren't terrible, but they weren't like this world breaking weapon that we would later see it become. Whereas it seems like the cavalry was where Rome really had its edge. And again, in some of the battles against the Etruscans, cavalry alone won the battles. So, and you had said that the Romans, on paper came off the best, and they did, but when we get to Brennus's Gallic invasion, we'll see that while Rome looked strong on paper, it still had underlying weaknesses that the Gauls would later exploit. And so Rome was still not yet the world conquering empire that it would become. But one thing that we see also in these early histories is a lot of vignettes of heroic individuals doing heroic things, like Mucius, like Horatius, like Cincinnatus. And the issue here is partly, I think, why modern historians have been kind of down on Livy is because Livy does have a lot of these heroic flavor, text, if you will, for what's going on, where this heroic Roman stands up and does something courageous or heroic. And that's, I think, just more of a bias of modern day historians. I don't think there's any real reason to think that Livy's any less trustworthy than the other ancient sources. And you have to also ask yourself, I mean, Rome built the world's largest empire up until that time. Who else could have done it except men that engaged in these kinds of heroics? I mean, you have to have a plausible explanation for who built what kind of men would have taken who've built the Roman Empire. Well, the kind of men that Livy describes. I mean, who else could have done it, right?
Agreed. Yeah. Rome still had it always had domestic conflicts to deal with between the plebs and the patricians. And also, there was the issue often of, how long service was going to have to be carried out by the various plebs in the Roman army. With the Gallic invasion, they basically had the advantage of not having to maintain a system like the Romans and giving them this sort of tactical, this doctrine where they can come in and raid and they don't have to maintain these city states, because the Gauls of that time weren't so much a city state power, but more of like a I wouldn't say nomads either, but basically sort of nomads of this era of antiquity, where again they don't have a robust tax system, they don't have a more complex social system that the Romans had to deal with. And so, yeah, I think, with these next few episodes, like the Gallic invasion, I think we'll see that, Rome definitely has some answers for this. But, I mean, typically what people see with Rome is just like these successful, the successful application of the legion and frontier encampments and robust cavalry. But what people don't often see behind the scenes is, a lot of logistical strains to maintain legions, to maintain longer campaigns, and then also, again, problems at home, because that's sort of a recurring theme there. I think I don't know. I'm not sure if you wanted to cover as well, like the fighting at Sutrium and Tarquini, or anything like that.
No, I think those three wars we've discussed already are today's episode. So yeah, as I guess what I'll end with is, against all the odds, Rome did defeat all of its enemies, despite having really serious internal divisions. But we already see beginning with the Volscian War how Roman system of allies is really crucial to its survival. In much the same way that Rome would never have survived, no other ancient state could have suffered the losses Rome did against Hannibal and continued fighting. In an analogous way, not that the Volscians ever came near to scoring as crushing defeats on Rome as Hannibal did. It's one might wonder, could the Romans have actually defeated the Volscians without the aid of the Latins and the Hernicans, and even more so had the Latins been on the side of the Volscians. So we already see that Rome's survival in this very early phase is already predicated on them building these bilateral treaties and alliances with friendly city-states. Last word to you.
Sure. Yeah, that's. I think I definitely agree with that, and I will say too that didn't early on when Rome was a kingdom. I think Rome was actually successfully sacked by the Gauls. Is that correct?
When Rome, oh, you mean under the Etruscan period? I don't know.
Yeah, I believe, and it was early on. I think this was. I think we're talking like 6th century BC or something like that. I think Rome was successfully raided and largely destroyed, I think, by a Gallic invasion. But I'll have to look into that later. But no, I think we did a decent job of covering those 3 conflicts, as there's just a lot of territory to cover in early Roman history. But yeah, I mean, I think again we're just seeing the formation, the more successful and universal application of the legion, and Rome's cavalry is becoming more formalized. And then, of course, we have just more widespread colonization in places like modern-day southern France and areas around places like Monaco, and trading with Corsica and Sardinia in northern Africa, as well as the Iberian Peninsula. And this, of course, led to, about 2 centuries later, the ability for Rome to call upon, foreign forces to help in future conflicts. But yeah, we'll get at it again next week.
All right. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the President Folly Podcast, signing off.